Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It all started as a simple road trip, a chance to get away from the daily grind. Eric and I, both stuck in the relentless cycle of office life, had been talking about doing something spontaneous for months. We were tired of the same old routine, the endless hours at our desks, the same coffee breaks, the same screens. So, when we finally decided to just hit the road, it felt like an escape. A chance to shake off the weight of our daily lives and breathe in something new, something wild. It was one of those warm days when the sun still clung to the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert-like landscape. The plan was simple: start in Los Angeles, drive north through California, and just see where we ended up. No strict itinerary, no deadlines. We were free. The first few hours were great. We cruised along the Pacific Coast Highway, the wind in our hair, the radio playing some old rock tunes. We laughed, reminisced about high school, talked about everything and nothing. The world felt big, full of possibilities, and I couldn't remember the last time I felt so alive. But by the time we hit the outskirts of Bakersfield, things started to slow down. The sunset had come and gone, leaving a deep darkness in its wake. The highway stretched out ahead, empty and desolate. The lights from the town behind us faded as we drove further into the night, leaving only the soft glow of the car's headlights to illuminate the road ahead. We'd been driving for what felt like hours, and the monotony was starting to set in. The road was flat, unchanging, and there wasn't much to look at besides endless stretches of empty land. Eric had been dozing off in the passenger seat, his head nodding to the rhythm of the car's movement. I had the window cracked slightly, feeling the cool desert air rush past, but even that couldn't shake the sense of isolation creeping up on me. "Hey, man," Eric said groggily, rubbing his eyes. "We should stop somewhere. I need to stretch my legs and grab a snack." I glanced at the gas gauge, still a quarter tank left, and looked at the empty stretch of road ahead. "There's a turnout coming up in about a mile. We can stop there." Eric didn't say much more. He simply nodded, then went back to scrolling through his phone. The glow of the screen was the only light in the car, casting a dim, bluish hue on his face as he tapped away. As I made the turn into the turnout, the car's tires crunched against the gravel, and I could feel the weight of the quiet around us. The night had grown eerily still. There wasn't a single sound except for the soft rustling of the wind, and even that felt muffled, like the world was holding its breath. The turnout was small, just a dirt lot off the highway. It was barely wide enough for two cars to park comfortably. A faded street lamp hung overhead, its light flickering intermittently, casting long, unnatural shadows on the ground. The whole place had the feel of a forgotten spot, a place where no one really came. The road was so isolated that it felt like we'd driven into a different world entirely, one that existed outside of time. I shifted the car into park and cut the engine. For a moment, we just sat there taking it all in. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. No traffic, no sound of life. I could hear my heart thudding in my chest. "Man, this place is creepy," Eric finally said, breaking the silence. He had that look in his eyes, the one that said he was starting to feel it too. The unease that was slowly creeping in, a sense of being watched even though there was nothing there. I shrugged it off. "It's fine, just a quiet place to stop. I could use a break anyway." We both got out of the car. The dry desert air hit me like a cold slap to the face. I breathed in, the air smelling of dust and earth, tinged with the faintest trace of sagebrush. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes as we walked toward the edge of the turnout, where a barren field stretched out into the distance. There were no lights, no signs of civilization for miles, just dark, rolling hills that blended into the night sky. Eric went off to the side to do his business, and I wandered around aimlessly, stretching my legs. The darkness around us felt strange, oppressive almost, like it was closing in. There wasn't a single light to break the endless blackness. Nothing to remind me that there was a world beyond this desolate stretch of highway. I glanced around, scanning the empty landscape. In the distance, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A truck. An old, rusted thing, its body painted a dull shade of red. It was parked off the side of the road, facing us. The headlights were off, but it was positioned in such a way that it felt like it was watching us. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had appeared out of nowhere, like it had been parked there for hours, waiting for us to pull in. "Hey, Eric." I called over my shoulder, but my voice sounded strange in the quiet night air. "Check that truck out. Where did that come from?" Eric looked up from where he was standing and followed my gaze. For a moment, he was silent, then he shrugged. "Probably just some old guy camping out or something," he said nonchalantly. But I could tell by the way he avoided looking at it that he was starting to feel the weirdness too. I stood there for a second longer, my eyes fixed on the truck. It was a strange thing, old, worn down, and abandoned looking, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It seemed so out of place in the middle of nowhere. There was no other car around, no sign of any human presence nearby, just this one truck parked and waiting. Eric finally came back, and we both walked back toward the car. We didn't say much, just a few awkward glances exchanged, both of us trying to shake off the discomfort we were feeling. But something about that truck kept nagging at me, like I was missing something important. I slid into the driver's seat and started the car. The engine hummed to life, and for a moment I thought we'd be fine. But then, out of nowhere, the truck's headlights flashed on. It was sudden, like a slap to the face. The blinding lights cut through the dark like a hot knife through butter, and I froze for a second, not knowing how to react. I wasn't sure what I'd just seen. The truck hadn't moved, had it? The lights were bright, too bright for such an old vehicle. The intensity of them made my pulse quicken. I instinctively slammed my foot on the brake, but I was already staring in disbelief. Eric's voice broke through my shock. "What the hell? Did it just turn on?" I looked at him, my eyes wide. "Yeah, I don't know. That's not normal." We both sat there, staring at the truck, unable to look away. The silence was shattered by the sudden roar of the engine. It was loud. Too loud. The noise pierced the stillness of the night, vibrating the air around us. I felt it deep in my chest, like the earth itself was shaking. The truck was alive now, active and moving. The lights blinked on, illuminating the surrounding desert in an eerie glow. I glanced at Eric. His eyes were wide with fear now, his face pale. I could see his knuckles tightening on the seat as he sat forward, trying to make sense of what was happening. I don't know why, but at that moment my instinct told me to drive. Fast. I didn't even wait to think about it. I threw the car into reverse and tore out of the turnout, the gravel spinning beneath the tires. The engine roared louder, the truck's headlights growing bigger and bigger in the rearview mirror. Something told me that we weren't alone anymore. I didn't know what was happening, but everything inside me was screaming to get away. I floored the gas pedal, not even bothering to look at the speedometer. The car shot forward, its tires gripping the cracked asphalt, the engine whining as it fought to gain speed. But that truck was right behind us. It wasn't just following at a normal distance, it was right on our tail. The headlights in the rearview mirror were blinding now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the truck was pushing us, chasing us down with a relentless, single-minded purpose. "Go, go, go!" Eric yelled from the passenger seat, his voice thick with panic. He was clutching the armrest like his life depended on it, which, in that moment, I felt like it did. I glanced in the mirror again. The truck was still there, barely a few feet away, and its headlights were so close now, I could almost feel the heat coming off them. The way it stayed so perfectly aligned with our car made my heart race. It wasn't just driving behind us, it was tailgating us, forcing us to speed up. There was no room for us to maneuver, no way to shake it off. It was like the truck was hunting us, anticipating every move we made. The road ahead was just a straight line, the highway stretching into the darkness with no turns in sight. But I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up. The sedan was beginning to feel like a sitting duck, its small frame nothing compared to the massive truck. It was only a matter of time before it caught up, and when it did, I wasn't sure we'd survive it. "Dude, hit the gas harder," Eric screamed, his face pale, eyes wide. He was practically shaking now, his breath shallow. I could hear the tension in his voice, the panic growing. "That thing's not letting up. It's like it knows what we're gonna do." I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles were aching, but there was no room to go faster. The car was already maxed out, and still, the truck's engine kept roaring louder and louder, a constant thrum that shook the whole car. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. The truck wasn't just following now. It was pushing us. The headlights were so close they were almost blinding. A sharp jolt hit the back of the car, and I could feel it in my bones. The truck had slammed into us. I jerked forward in my seat, barely able to keep the car steady as it lurched forward. "Jesus," I shouted, trying to regain control of the wheel. The tires squealed as I yanked the car to the left, but the truck stayed right behind us, like it was attached to us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think straight. My head was spinning, my heart hammering in my chest. Before I could react, another hit, a harder one this time. The car rocked violently, and I swerved toward the shoulder of the highway. I could feel the car losing control, the tires skidding on the uneven road. For a second, I thought we were going to flip, but I managed to correct it just in time. "Come on, come on!" Eric yelled, his voice shaking with terror. He was gripping the dashboard now, and our eyes locked on the road ahead. "We need to find somewhere to pull over. Somewhere. Anywhere. That's safe." But there was nowhere. There was nothing out there but empty highway. "Hold on," I shouted, my voice cracking. My hands were slick with sweat as I kept the car steady. The truck hit us again, this time spinning us slightly, and I had to fight against the wheel to keep from crashing. I could feel the weight of the truck like it was trying to push us into the dirt, off the road entirely. But just when I thought we were done for, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, just a small flicker at first, but it was something. A gas station. Just a single pump and a glowing neon sign that flickered weakly in the dark. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was our only chance. "We're going for it," I yelled, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed my foot down harder on the gas pedal, the engine growling as the car surged forward. The truck, relentless as ever, slammed into us once more, pushing us off course. The car's rear end fishtailed, and for a split second I thought we were going to end up in a ditch. But I swerved sharply, my tires screeching against the pavement, and somehow managed to keep the car on track. "Just a little further," I muttered under my breath, hoping like hell we could make it. The truck rammed us again, harder this time. My whole body was jolted forward, and I barely managed to keep control. The gas station was getting closer now, the flickering lights brighter, and I could feel a glimmer of hope rising in my chest. We were almost there. We just had to make it. With one final desperate push, I swerved the car into the lot, tires screeching as the gravel underfoot kicked up around us. I didn't even look back. I just threw the car into park and slammed the door open, leaping out as fast as I could. Eric was already halfway to the gas station's entrance, his legs unsteady, his face as pale as a ghost. I followed him, my heart still racing, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could still hear the truck's engine in the distance. its roar fading slowly as it stopped on the road just outside the station. The moment we stepped into the gas station, I felt like I could breathe again. The door slammed shut behind us with a hollow thud, and I turned to look at the small, dimly lit shop. It was empty except for the elderly man behind the counter who didn't seem too surprised to see us, just tired like he'd seen it all before. "Hey, are you all right?" the man asked, eyeing us with a mix of curiosity and concern. Eric stumbled over his words, trying to explain what had just happened. "There's this truck, this guy. He kept chasing us. He was trying to run us off the road. It's not safe out there. You have to call the cops or something." The man nodded, his face turning serious. "I'll call them right away. Don't worry, you're safe here now." The clerk made the call, his voice calm as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. We could hear the operator on the other end asking questions, confirming our location. We didn't have much hope that the police would arrive in time. After all, it was a quiet stretch of highway, and the truck had already disappeared. But the clerk was insistent, speaking clearly, giving them every detail we could remember. He made sure they understood how dangerous the situation had been. Within minutes, we heard the unmistakable sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. When the police arrived, they took everything seriously. They immediately spoke to us, asking for details and trying to get a description of the truck. The officers were professional, asking calm and specific questions as they took notes. "You're lucky you made it here," the officer said after taking our statement. "We'll keep an eye on this stretch of road tonight. You did the right thing by pulling over." I nodded, still in shock. "But there's no sign of the truck. We swear it was right behind us." "We'll keep looking," the officer reassured us. "It's not uncommon for cars to get stuck out here. Sometimes people drive off-road, get lost. We'll check the area, make sure there's no one out there doing something illegal." The deputy added, "We'll also check for any possible traffic cams or reports of any other strange incidents along the highway." They asked us if we wanted to stay and wait for their investigation, but after everything that had happened, we were desperate to leave. We thanked them, though, grateful for their professionalism and attention. As the police car left the lot, we both felt a little safer. The officers had reassured us that we were no longer in immediate danger. They promised they would check the area thoroughly, and their presence helped lift the weight off my chest. Eric and I spent the next few hours recovering at the gas station. The clerk was kind enough to let us stay inside, where we caught our breath trying to process everything that had just happened. When the time came, the police drove by once more on their patrol, making sure we were still safe before leaving us to continue on our way. By the time we were ready to leave, the night had stretched on. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind the blanket of desert air. I was reluctant to get back into the car, but we had to move forward. "Do you think it's really over?" Eric asked, his voice uncertain. The tension still hung thick between us. "I don't know," I said quietly. "But it feels like it is. The police are keeping watch, and nothing's followed us here. I think we're okay now." We slowly made our way back onto the highway. The darkness felt different now, calmer, even though the fear still lingered. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the rearview mirror, but when I looked again, there was nothing. It wasn't until we got closer to Fresno that I finally felt like I could breathe again. The truck hadn't come back. The night had passed, and we were still safe. But sometimes, when I drive late at night and I catch a glimpse of headlights behind me in the rearview mirror, I can't help but to remember that incident. I can still feel that heavy weight of the truck's presence, the blinding headlights, and the fear that I couldn't escape. And for a split second, my mind still wonders, is it still out there, waiting? It's strange how your mind can play tricks on you when you're in unfamiliar places. It's like, no matter how prepared you think you are, there's always that moment when something happens, something you weren't expecting, something that jolts you awake and makes you question everything. The kind of thing that you can't shake off, no matter how many years pass. This is one of those stories. It's real, and I still can't explain it. I'm Dylan. I'm just a regular guy, not really into horror movies or thrill seeking. But when my three friends, Mark, Jess, and Vanessa, decided to take a road trip down California's Highway 395 toward Mammoth Lakes, I was all in. It had been a while since any of us had done something spontaneous, so we were all excited. It wasn't anything wild, just a simple road trip, taking the time to enjoy the open road, the endless desert landscapes, and the quiet freedom that only comes with a good long drive. We started our trip around noon, just as the sun was blazing in the sky, so we didn't think much of it when we passed through small, quiet towns, their streets empty except for the occasional car or stray dog wandering along the sidewalk. The windows were down, and the wind blasted our faces as we laughed and joked, singing along to the radio. It felt like we had all the time in the world. It was supposed to be one of those trips where you just go with the flow, right? No real destination in mind. We all needed a break. Mark was exhausted from work. Jess and Vanessa were looking for an escape from their daily routines, and I was just trying to clear my head. So we all piled into the van and hit the road. We'd been on the road for hours, the desert stretching out endlessly around us. By the time we reached a small rest stop just outside a tiny town, it was well past midnight. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind a sky full of stars, but the moon barely seemed to shine, as if the desert had swallowed all the light. The rest stop was nothing more than a gravel parking lot with a single street lamp flickering dimly. The only other vehicles around were a few old, rusted trucks parked near the edge of the lot. At first glance, the place seemed fine. Quiet, sure, but nothing to worry about. We hadn't seen another car for miles and it had been hours since we passed a gas station. Our only real options were either to sleep here for a few hours or drive another 100 miles, which none of us were eager to do. So we decided to park, lock the van doors, and rest for the night. The night air was chilly, even for the desert, and it crept through the small cracks in the van's old windows, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up a little. I didn't think much of it, though. I just pulled the curtains shut, laid back in my seat, and closed my eyes, listening to the soft hum of the van's engine slowly winding down as everyone else settled in. Jess and Vanessa had their own little area in the back, both of them already half asleep, murmuring to each other about random things. Mark was up front with me, his head back against the seat, his breathing deep and slow. The only sound was the occasional rustling of the wind outside and the odd groan of the van's engine cooling off. I thought to myself, this is it, just a quiet night under the stars. Nothing could go wrong. Little did I know, things were about to take a turn. Something was out there. Something I wasn't prepared to face. It was hard to say exactly when it started. The night felt oddly still, the kind of quiet you only get when you're deep in the desert. There was no sound except the occasional gust of wind that would rattle the van slightly, and the distant hum of the old street lamp as it flickered in and out. I tried to focus on the soft rhythm of my breathing, hoping to drift into sleep. But then I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable. Just a faint tapping against the window, so soft that I almost thought it was the wind. But then it came again, a little louder, a little more insistent. I froze, the kind of sudden stillness that gripped you from the inside. My pulse quickened. I strained to listen, trying to figure out if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. And then, knock. It was louder, sharp and clear, sending a cold shiver down my spine. I felt my eyes widen, my body tense. I wasn't imagining it. Something, or someone, was outside the van. I glanced over at Mark. He had been half dozing, but now his eyes were wide open, staring at the window in confusion. Vanessa and Jess hadn't noticed yet, still curled up in the back, but I could hear their faint murmurs as they shifted in their sleep. The knock came again, this time followed by a low scraping sound, like someone was dragging something heavy across the gravel. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Mark, my voice tight with unease. Mark nodded slowly, his face pale. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat up a little straighter, his eyes darting to the side window. The wind had stopped. It was too quiet now, almost unnaturally so. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The knocking continued, more frantic now, each thud shaking the van just a little. It wasn't some passerby. It was purposeful, deliberate. "What the hell is that?" Jess's voice cracked from the back, the first sign of panic creeping into her tone. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The fear in the air thickened, settling like a weight on my chest. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but none came. There was nothing here. The town was hours behind us, and the nearest gas station was miles away. Mark leaned toward the front window, peering through a small gap in the curtain, his breath shallow. His face went white as he jerked back, and his hand shaking as it fell to his lap. "Dylan," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's someone out there. A man." My stomach twisted into a tight knot. I wanted to look to see what he had seen, but part of me was too terrified to even move. The thought of looking into the darkness and seeing someone, standing there just out of sight was too much to bear. But I had to know. I had to see. I forced myself to lean forward, to peer through the narrow slit in the curtain. At first, it was just shadows, blending with the dark asphalt and the faint light of the flickering street lamp. But then I saw it. A figure. A man. Standing just outside the van. I couldn't make out his features, but I could see the outline of him clearly. Tall, wearing a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the night. I could feel the hairs on my arms rise, my breath caught in my throat. He was standing perfectly still, like he was waiting for something, waiting for us. Then another figure stepped into view, and another. They were silent, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were creeping into the shadows, out of sight, only to reappear just beyond the edge of the light. I couldn't see their faces either, but I knew they were there. More of them. At least 4 now, all positioned around the van, hidden in the darkness, just far enough from the flickering light to stay obscured. Jess whispered, "What do they want?" I could hear the panic in her voice now, the sharp edge of fear. Mark's face was twisted in confusion, eyes darting between the figures outside. None of us spoke. No one knew what to say. What could we say? No explanation could make sense of this. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a tap anymore. It was a pounding, slamming fists against the side of the van. My whole body tensed as if I were about to be yanked out of my seat. The sound was almost deafening now. The van itself shook slightly, rattling as if it might collapse under the force of the blows. Then a new sound, scratching. Someone was dragging something across the metal of the van, scraping it in slow, agonizing strokes. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind went blank and my hands were frozen at my sides. I wanted to scream, but the fear had locked me in place. "Dylan, start the van," Jess hissed, her voice tight with terror. She was desperate now. I didn't need any more prompting. My hands were shaking violently as I grabbed the ignition, fumbling for the keys. The pounding didn't stop. It only grew louder, more forceful. The sound of fists against metal like a warning. But it didn't matter. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the van jerked forward with a harsh growl. The headlights blared to life, cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them. More of them, standing around us in the dim light. At least 6 people. Some looked like they hadn't showered in days, their clothes ragged and torn. Others were more unsettling, wild eyes, dark stares, unmoving. One man stood motionless, just grinning at us. The world outside felt suffocating now. We weren't alone. We weren't safe. The pounding on the van didn't stop as we sped away. We raced down the road, heart pounding, eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I kept expecting someone to jump in front of the van to chase us, but they didn't. They stayed behind, fading into the darkness as we left them behind. Still, my foot stayed pressed to the pedal. The van was moving faster now, but my heart still pounded in my chest like it might burst. No one spoke, not a word. Jess was clutching the seat in front of her, eyes wide with terror. Mark was staring straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the door. Vanessa sat as still as a statue, her face pale. We didn't stop driving until we reached a gas station, miles down the road, the lights of the station glowing like a beacon in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot, but I didn't immediately turn off the engine. I sat there for a long time, hands shaking on the wheel, my mind reeling from what had just happened. None of us said a word, not for the longest time. We all just sat there, staring into the darkness outside, our hearts still racing, the fear lingering in the air like smoke. Every breath I took felt too loud, like it might give away our position. But nothing happened. The world outside stayed still, just as quiet as it had been before. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant. "We can't stop at rest stops anymore. Not like that." It was quiet, but it was enough. And with that, everything changed. The silence in the van was broken, but the fear wasn't. It never really left. It's funny how a night that seems so ordinary in the moment can turn into something you can never forget. That night in Santa Cruz was one of those. Looking back, I wonder if there was something more to it, some kind of sign, or maybe just sheer stupidity on my part. Whatever it was, I can't erase it from my mind. I still think about it, sometimes when I'm alone or driving down an empty road, and I can almost feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, as if the same thing is about to happen all over again. I'd been hanging out with Jake for most of the day, helping set up for the party. It wasn't like we were party animals or anything, but we were young, and it seemed like a good way to blow off some steam. The air was warm, and the ocean breeze rolling in from the coast smelled like salt and freedom. But things got rowdy, like they always do. It was that kind of party where you just kind of lose track of time. There were strangers everywhere. Some you recognized, others you didn't. Music blaring, laughter echoing in every corner of the house. But honestly, none of it mattered. I wasn't even enjoying myself by the end of the night. Jake and I decided to leave around 2 a.m. I'm not sure what made us go. Maybe it was just the fact that we had an early morning ahead of us, or maybe it was the feeling that something just wasn't right anymore. People had started to get too drunk, fights had broken out, and the whole place had this strange undercurrent of tension. So we slipped out quietly and made our way to the car. The drive back to Los Angeles was supposed to be an easy one, just a couple of hours down the highway. We'd been through the coastal route enough times that it should have been familiar. But that night, it felt different. It felt like the road itself was alive, stretching and bending in ways I couldn't explain. We were two tired guys in a car, tired from the party, tired from everything. But the highway stretched on forever, like it would never end. The headlights from my old car sliced through the darkness, but it never seemed to reach far enough. It was like we were driving through a tunnel of blackness, swallowed by the night. Jake passed out almost immediately, his body leaning against the window. The sound of his slow, steady breathing was the only thing that kept me grounded. The hum of the engine became a kind of background noise, and the faint smell of beer mixed with the salty scent of the sea in the air. I tried to stay alert, but the quiet got to me. The road felt endless, like it was just looping into itself. Every mile seemed like the same as the last. By the time we hit Big Sur, I was starting to get that uncomfortable feeling. The kind you get when you've been driving for too long and your mind starts playing tricks on you. The winding curves of the highway seemed to go on forever, hugging the cliffs as the ocean roared below us. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was faint but constant, like a reminder that you're on the edge of the world. There was no one else around, just us, the car, and the vast, dark night. I glanced over at Jake, wondering if he was still awake, but he was deep in sleep. I envied that. The stillness of the road, the emptiness of it, had a way of wearing on you. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel, trying to shake off the unease that had started to creep into my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just the weariness of the night setting in, making everything feel too big, too quiet. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I almost convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a shadow cast by the headlights or some illusion of the dark. But then I saw him clearly. A man standing at the side of the road. A hitchhiker. He was waving his hand. The moment I saw him, a wave of unease washed over me. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was because we were so far from any civilization, or because it was just so damned late. But something about him didn't sit right. The guy was wearing a hood, pulled low over his face, but I could still make out the contours of his jaw. He looked older, mid-30s maybe, though it was hard to tell for sure. He was dressed in all black, and I remember thinking how out of place he looked, standing there on the edge of the highway, a solitary figure in the dark. It wasn't even a place where you'd usually see people standing, let alone someone hitchhiking. I glanced at Jake again, but he was still out cold. I could have just driven past him. I should have. I could have told myself I didn't see him, or that it wasn't my problem. The rational part of me said I should just keep going, but there was this voice in my head that wouldn't let it go. It kept saying, what if he's in trouble? What if he needs help? We were on a stretch of highway near Big Sur with nothing but trees and cliffs surrounding us. The thought of someone being stranded out there was enough to get me to stop. Maybe it was the alcohol still lingering in my system, making me feel more generous than I should have been. Or maybe it was just the guilt of leaving someone out there in the middle of nowhere. Either way, I did it. I hit the brakes, the tires making a squealing sound as I slowed down. The car drifted to the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath us as I pulled over. I glanced over at Jake again, wondering if I should wake him up, but I didn't. I reached over and pushed the button to unlock the passenger door, and I waited. I don't know how long. It wasn't like I was eager to pick him up, but I was hesitant. I just didn't know what else to do. He didn't make a move at first. It felt like forever before I saw him start walking toward the car. His steps were slow, deliberate. There was no hurry, no sign of panic or distress. He just walked. He didn't even glance at me as he reached the door, just nodded slightly. His eyes were shadowed by the hood, but I could tell he was looking down at the ground. When he climbed into the back seat, the air in the car shifted. Something about him felt heavy. I didn't look at him, didn't say anything. I just put the car in drive and started to pull away. I could see him through the rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat. His hooded face was still shadowed, his hands resting on his lap. He didn't say a word. For a few minutes, I tried to keep the silence from swallowing the car whole. "Where you headed?" I asked, my voice feeling too loud in the quiet. He barely moved, but his lips parted slightly. "South," he said. Just that. One word. And then he went silent again. That was all. That was all he said. Jake stirred in his sleep beside me. I didn't look at him, didn't say anything. The car hummed as we drove, and every second that passed, it felt like the world was pulling further and further away from us. Time seemed to drag on in that car. I don't know how long we'd been driving after picking up the hitchhiker, but the silence between the three of us felt thick, like it had weight. I could feel it pressing in from all sides. The road stretched out endlessly before us, twisting and turning like it was never going to end. I tried to focus on the road, on keeping the car steady, but the longer I kept my eyes on the dark highway, the more I felt like something was watching me, watching us. I glanced at Jake again, trying to read his expression. He was staring out the window, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. His eyes were wide open, but he remained silent, completely still. I could tell he was fully awake now, so I decided to tell him about the guy in the back seat. I stole another look in the rearview mirror. He hadn't moved since he got in, not once. His head was slightly tilted down and his hood still shielded most of his face. It was strange how still he was. I know people say that some people are creepy because they're quiet or reserved, but this guy felt wrong. The way he just sat there, silent, unmoving, almost made it seem like he wasn't a person at all, like he was some kind of ghost, just occupying space for reasons I couldn't understand. His hands were folded in his lap, his fingers barely twitching, and that damn bag of his. He kept it close. Too close. It was on the floor between his feet, almost like he was protecting it. Every time the car hit a bump or a curve, I could hear the faint rustle of the bag, but it wasn't like it was shifting around. No, it was more like the bag was making sure it stayed in the same position, like it was part of him. So, I asked, my voice sounding much too loud in the stillness. "What's your name?" For a moment, he didn't answer. It felt like the longest pause of my life. His head remained tilted down, and I couldn't even make out his eyes in the rearview mirror. Then, in that same deep, gravelly tone, he muttered, "Doesn't matter." I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't know what he meant by it. The silence returned, and with it, a sense of unease. I tried to shake it off. We were almost halfway through Big Sur now, and I knew the road ahead would be more familiar. I kept thinking that once we were out of the winding cliffs and trees, things would feel more normal. But they didn't. The man in the back seat was like a shadow, just lurking there. And no matter how many times I glanced in the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "This is weird, man," Jake said quietly, almost as if he didn't want the hitchhiker to hear. His voice was low, but there was a nervous edge to it. "This guy's creeping me out." I didn't say anything at first. What could I say? I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I was beginning to agree with him. "Yeah," I murmured, trying to act casual. "I think we should have just kept driving. I don't know why I stopped." Jake didn't respond, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing. And then, as if on cue, the hitchhiker shifted in his seat. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my pulse race. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and I could see him leaning forward, just a little, his hand resting on the seat in front of him. It was such a small movement, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Then the hitchhiker spoke. "Pull over," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I need to take a leak." The way he said it, the tone of his voice, it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like an order. I didn't question it at first. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, and I slowed down, instinctively looking for a spot to pull over. There was no one else on the road, not a single car in sight. It felt like we were the only ones alive on that stretch of highway. "Yeah, all right," I said, my voice shaky now. I could feel my heart racing as I pulled off the road and onto the shoulder. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I slowed to a stop, the headlights cutting through the dark. The world outside felt quiet, unnervingly quiet. I couldn't see much outside the car except the trees lining the side of the road and the thick darkness beyond them. I glanced over at Jake, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as he stared out the windshield, watching the hitchhiker step out of the car. "Dude, what the hell?" Jake whispered, his voice tight. "This is weird." I nodded, unable to speak. I kept my eyes on the spot where the hitchhiker had disappeared into the trees, half expecting to see him come back at any second. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent trees swaying in the wind. I waited. A minute passed, then two. My grip on the wheel tightened as I looked back toward the trees. It felt like I was waiting for something, but I wasn't sure what. 5 minutes passed. 10. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't like this, man," he said, his voice low and tense. "Where the hell is he?" I was about to respond when something caught my eye. The bag. The hitchhiker's bag, which had been resting at his feet, was still sitting on the floor in the back seat, and something about it made my stomach drop. I hadn't even thought to check it earlier, but now I couldn't stop looking at it. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to touch it, but something in my gut told me that I had to. Jake was already halfway to the back seat before I could even process what was happening. My body moved on its own, like it was reacting before I could even think. I turned my head sharply and looked at Jake, my eyes wide with panic. "Dude, don't," I whispered, barely able to form the words. My voice sounded strangled, like my throat was closing up. Jake froze, his hand hovering just above the bag. The tension in the air felt like it was choking me. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, pounding like a drum. There was no sound outside the car, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Everything felt impossibly still, like the world was holding its breath. "What the hell is in this bag?" Jake asked quietly, but his voice was strained, like he already knew the answer. He was looking at the bag, his hands still lingering over it. I couldn't answer. I just stared at it. The bag was too close, too real. "Should we open it?" Jake's voice was barely above a whisper now. There was a nervous edge to it, something I hadn't heard in his voice before. His hand was shaking slightly as it hovered over the zipper. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. I didn't want to look, but I had to know. We both had to know. With a soft, almost reverent sound, Jake pulled the zipper open, and the first thing I saw was the roll of duct tape. Thick, industrial-strength tape, tightly wound in neat, even circles. Too neat of place, too neat. The next thing that made my stomach drop was the zip ties, a whole bunch of them. They were crammed into the bag like they were meant to be used for something terrible. I felt a wave of nausea flood through me. But it was the last item in the bag that really hit me. The thing I didn't want to see, the thing that made my skin crawl. It was a hunting knife. A large, heavy one, the kind you see in survival stores. The kind that could tear through flesh with ease. The steel blade glinted in the dim light, and I couldn't stop staring at it. It felt like it was staring back at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air in the car had turned cold, and I couldn't help but glance over at the trees again, my eyes scanning the dark, expecting to see the hitchhiker standing there, watching us from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just darkness. I don't know how long we sat there in that frozen silence, but I felt like the weight of the world was pressing in on me. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. It was like the very air had thickened, turning into something suffocating. Jake broke the silence with a curse, his voice low and harsh. "We need to go. Now." It was the kind of command that snapped me out of my trance, and I didn't hesitate. Without even thinking, I slammed the car into drive, my foot hitting the gas with a force that sent the tires screeching against the gravel. The engine roared to life, and the car shot forward, kicking up dust behind us. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I couldn't bring myself to glance in the rearview mirror again, to see if the hitchhiker was standing there, watching us, or worse, if he was already running to catch up with us. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles turning white. I could feel Jake's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. The silence between us now was thick with tension, the kind that could only be born from the understanding that something terrible had just been avoided. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I just kept driving, faster now, my foot heavy on the gas. I didn't want to be anywhere near where we picked him up. I didn't want to be anywhere near that dark stretch of road again. I couldn't stop thinking about the knife, about the duct tape, about the zip ties. I don't know how much time passed before we reached a gas station. When we finally pulled into the parking lot, I didn't even look around before I threw the car into park and killed the engine. The stillness of the night outside was almost too much to bear. It was too quiet now. I sat there for a few seconds, just trying to breathe, trying to calm down. Jake didn't move, and neither of us spoke for a long while. Finally, Jake broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "What the hell just happened, man?" I shook my head slowly, trying to make sense of it all, but no matter how hard I tried, it didn't make sense. How could it? We had picked up a stranger, a man who, in retrospect, felt like something out of a nightmare. His presence was unsettling, and the bag he carried was too much to ignore. I knew we had barely escaped something terrible, but I didn't want to know what that something was. I didn't want to know what could have happened if we hadn't reacted fast enough. The thought of it still makes my stomach churn, even now. The rest of the drive to Los Angeles was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that even though we were safe, the terror of that night wasn't finished. Not yet. I don't know if I'll ever know the true story of that hitchhiker. Maybe he was just a man looking for a ride, or maybe he was something much darker. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.